What's up guys, TopTier Yugioh here, and today I just want to have a discussion about what exactly makes a deck good. So what are some of the best decks, what is the best deck, and what are some of the characteristics that all of these decks share to help us answer these questions when analyzing past, present, and future formats. And now before getting started, please guys do me one quick favor. Go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. That way you're going to be notified when I release more content because I have a lot of really good stuff planned coming up soon. So thank you guys for doing that, but it's time to jam. And so first things first, there are 5 characteristics that all good decks share in various degrees, but it's the extent in which they exemplify these that separate the strong decks from the weak ones. Identifying these 5 characteristics will allow us to determine what to play and what to prepare for. However, before getting to these, I want to discuss 2 pieces of literature that served as inspiration as well as reference points for these 5 major traits. And so the first is an article by Patrick Hoban called The 3 Characteristics of the Best Deck. Pretty similar, where he mentions 3 key factors: auto wins, consistency, and contradictions. Those are all pretty self-explanatory. The second is an article by Flores called The 7 Traits of the Best Deck, where he adds 7 more things to that list: an unbeatable hand, an unbeatable board, getting the most out of your mana, avoiding battles of attrition, being able to go over the top, the ability to bias resources, and then the ability to ignore card advantage. And now Flores' article mostly pertains to Magic the Gathering, so the terminology is a bit different, but if we translate that to Yu-Gi-Oh!, the first 2 traits that he mentioned refer to auto wins, like having an unbeatable hand or an unbeatable board. Those are auto wins. The second is efficiency, where he mentions getting the most out of your mana, which I have an entire video on, by the way, so if you want to check that out and learn more about efficiency in Yu-Gi-Oh!, click that link in the top right corner of the screen. But the next trait that he mentions is avoiding battles of attrition. This is about speed and power. Then he talks about going over the top, which refers to a deck's ability to win in different ways. Then to bias resources is to be able to make certain cards or groups of cards bad. And so think back to Cosmos and how they made all targeting cards and all the cards that destroy other ones bad. Like you didn't want to be playing Raigeki when Cosmo was good. Or think about how Spiral Resort made targeting bad. Or even better, think about Masterpiece and how he could be unaffected by anything pretty much. And so if your deck revolved around a single type of card, say spells, traps, or monster effects, you were going to be in trouble because it biased a lot of your resources. This is a trait that a lot of good decks share. And then finally, you definitely don't want to flat out ignore card advantage, but what he means is the ability to thrive and even win without it. Or to even have the ability to trade it for other resources instead. And so for example, if you have a lot of card advantage, but recognize it's time to trade that for other resources instead and become the beatdown, you have the ability to do that to put more damage aboard and potentially end the game. Even if it means losing card advantage, winning the game is always more important. But not all decks have those options, only the best do. Now overall, both of these articles are fantastic and I would recommend them to every competitive card game player. However, both are far from perfect. Both are missing some key components that I'm going to summarize and encompass in the 5 qualities of good decks. And these 5 qualities are power, consistency, efficiency, utility, and diversity. And we're going to clearly define each of these so that we can better use them in our own theory when evaluating decks. Starting from the top, power is an objective measure of what a deck does. And obviously the objective of any game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is to win that game, and so it measures your ability to actually end and win the game. But if we're looking at the physical definition of power, it's the rate at which you do work. And that depends on the amount of work that you do and the time it takes to do it. The formula for this is like work divided by time. And if you want to increase the power, you either need to increase the work or decrease the time it takes to do it. And this really leads to 2 different ways of looking at power, both of which are consistent with that definition because of those 2 factors. And we can look at it from either standpoint of trying to do more work, which in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Really correlates most with the deck's ceiling. And so a more powerful deck's going to have a higher ceiling. Or we can look at decreasing the time it takes to play, which is the deck's speed. Because most powerful decks are also fast. It's inherent. And actually, speed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a really interesting thing right now, because historically we measured time in turns. Like a really fast deck will be able to do whatever that deck is trying to do in maybe 1 or 2 turns. However, now with these new time rules, we also have to start thinking about measuring time in minutes and seconds. And so if we look at a deck like Goki, it's fast in that you can do your major plays in a singular turn, but it's slow in that those combos might take you 5 to 10 minutes. And it's going to take even longer if you're unsure about your plays, you're trying to play around your opponent's interactions, or if your opponent has to read anything. And you really have to be cognizant not only of the number of turns it takes for your deck to get going, but the time it takes to play your deck, like the actual time. And so if we look at the format right now, the most powerful decks are Trickstars and the Nightmare decks, like Goki and Spiral. And all of these decks are powerful, but they exemplify the 2 different types of power. Goki and Spiral can create insane boards in a singular turn with Trigate Wizard for negation, tons of protection with the Nightmares, and Spiral can even top that off with a Sleeper. Their ceilings are incredibly high. Trickstars, on the other hand, don't really have that high of a ceiling. They can't summon anywhere near as many monsters or come close to what Spiral or Goki can do. But Trickstars are fast, man. They can do a lot of damage in a short amount of time. And any given turn might be game if they're allowed to attack directly. And so despite their differences, both decks are powerful. Overall though, power is the first characteristic of the best decks. It measures your ability to end the game, it depends on your ceiling as well as your speed, and it really correlates to Hoban's idea of auto wins and Flores' ideas of having an unbeatable hand and unbeatable board. And I really think this makes up about 30% of your deck's abilities, because we have these 5 traits, but they're not equal and you need all of them in some amount. And I'd say this is about 30% of the puzzle. Next, we have consistency. And consistency is an easy one, everyone always talks about it, and I'm sure we all have some vague idea of what it means. Consistently, simply put, is how often your deck is able to play optimally. And so again, power is your deck's ability to end the game, but consistency is how often you can do it. And similarly to power, it depends on 2 different factors and can be looked at from 2 different perspectives based on that. Positive and negative consistency. And so positive consistency is the idea of drawing well. It's positive. A consistent deck is one that draws well. And so increasing consistency might mean adding cards that allow you to draw better. It's like adding more combo pieces to your deck to draw your combo more often, or adding more extenders, or things of that nature to make sure that you draw well more often. But then we have negative consistency, which is the idea of drawing poorly. It's negative. A consistent deck is one that doesn't draw poorly, it doesn't brick. And so increasing this consistency might also mean taking out brick cards or cards that you don't want to draw. So this would be like not playing 2 Garnets or taking out a card that you don't want to see multiples of. And so whenever we're trying to affect the consistency, it usually comes down to one of these 2 things. Consistency can often be measured or quantified using statistics, and along with individual cards in your deck and the numbers of them, other factors can affect your consistency as well, such as the total number of cards in your deck. So that's also something you want to keep in mind when trying to adjust your consistency. Usually for messing with this, I would really recommend just doing the math. It's a lot easier. However, consistency is just the second characteristic of best decks. It measures how often you're able to play optimally, and I would say that it represents another 30% of your deck's overall abilities. So now we're up to 60% total, and so as we can see, power and consistency are the most important traits, but it's not all of that there is. But now we're going to talk about other factors that really separate the other tiers of decks. The third characteristic of good decks is efficiency. And this is something that Hoban actually overlooked, but Flores mentioned in his article when he talked about getting the most out of your mana. And in Yu-Gi-Oh! We don't have mana, which is a resource they use in Magic the Gathering, but we do want to get the most out of the resources that we do have in Yu-Gi-Oh! Namely card advantage, tempo, and fire. And so again, like power, efficiency is also a ratio. It's a ratio of the resources that you get out of a system to the resources that you put into it. And so to increase efficiency, we either need to get more resources out or put less of them in. An example of this would be Sky Strikers. If you look at a card like Ray, it's just one normal summon, which is a component of tempo. Ray, the card itself, which is a card so it deals with card advantage, can lead to 2 link summons, adding a card back from graveyard to your hand with Kagari, searching from the deck to the hand with Shizuku, and all you need for this is 2 of your extra deck monsters. And so you're trading your card advantage and your tempo and a little bit of fire for more card advantage. You're going from 1 card to 3, more tempo because you're link summoning a bunch of times, and you have more cards to play with at the cost of fire, which are the 2 cards in your extra deck. And now you compare this to most of the other decks where 1 card and 1 normal summon don't get you nearly as much. If you look at like a Goki deck, there's not a single normal summon in that deck that does that much, without having to have other cards as well. But just looking at 1 card and 1 normal summon, Ray is a really efficient card. But if you want to increase that efficiency, compare that to what you get out of using just a Hornet drones. You get the exact same output, but you put less resources into it. You don't have to use your normal summon. And so that's a more efficient play. And now another factor in efficiency is the ability to recycle resources, so that you don't run out of them, because if your deck is inefficient, you're generally going to have trouble playing the control, which can potentially force you into unfavorable situations. Anything that's efficient is going to be able to keep most of its resources and play for a longer period of time. And so again, as an example, let's go back to Sky Strikers, because they're one of the most efficient decks right now. And as we stated before, they already get a lot of value from their resources, but they also have the ability to recycle them and play near infinitely for free. And so before we mentioned that your singular normal summon can get you more tempo, more card advantage at the cost of some of your fire, which in this case are the remaining cards available to you. However, they can recycle their link monsters back into the extra deck to regain that lost fire in order to keep summoning them and keep gaining value. Most efficient decks share this trait. Another really good example of this would be True Dracos, to where they can do pretty much anything they want, but then use Disciples to shuffle all of them back into their deck and draw another card. And so as long as you play the deck correctly, they can never run out of resources. And now compare this to a deck like Goki, where you're going to do your combo 1 time, and if it doesn't work, you're never going to have the resources to do it again. You're never going to have all those nightmares in your extra deck again once you use them that first time. You're never going to have like another copy of Firewall and the Sold and stuff. So once you do it that first time, you better win that game, because they don't have the efficiency to do it again. And so Sky Strikers are an example of an efficient deck, Gokis are an example of an inefficient deck. And so efficiency is the 3rd characteristic of the best deck. It measures your ability to continue playing the game. Inefficient decks are not able to play for long because they will run out of resources, but the most efficient decks are able to play infinitely. Efficiency, while important, isn't as important as power or consistency, and so it only accounts for about 20% of a deck's overall strength, but it is a very important factor when analyzing them. And so up until now, we've talked about power, consistency, and efficiency. This covers 80% of the overall sort of analysis of a deck's abilities. And so these final 2 characteristics, utility and diversity, will account for the final 20%. And so they're both about 10% each, and so we're going to dive right into that. And so utility is the 4th characteristic. Utility is a deck's ability to react to various scenarios. Whether you need extenders, defense, removal, or multiple types of those, a deck with a lot of utility has it. And so this is the difference between like a pocket knife and a Swiss Army knife. And I think the best example of this is Burning Abyss. And so Burning Abyss had a lot of great cards like Dante, Beatrice, Skarm, Seer, Graf, Libic, excellent engine cards. But imagine how much worse they would have been without the utility of cards like Farfa, Alec, Calcab, Barbar, or even some of the other ones. Or like, think of Firelake. Firelake was an amazing card in certain formats. And so without those utility cards, I don't think Burning Abyss would have been nearly as good as it was at its apex. I think another example of this would be Sky Strikers, which literally have access to almost everything you could ever want in Archetype. And so if you need to destroy a monster, spells, traps, targeting, non-targeting, defense, negation, protection, whatever you could want, Sky Strikers have a way to get it. They have tons of utility, and it's one of the reasons why it's a top tier Yu-Gi-Oh deck. The 5th and final characteristic of the best deck is diversity. Diversity is your deck's ability to diversify its own plays and play non-linearly. It's the ability to use different lines of play, have multiple win conditions, and play multiple roles. It's where your matchups and interactions really come into play as well. And so for example, if a deck isn't diverse, it might lose singularly to a hand trap, or another deck's form of disruption. But a diverse deck can say, well, okay, so there's a hand trap that might stop my first play, but I can play around it if I do this, or maybe I'll do that instead. And so a diverse deck is able to play differently depending on the situation. And it's different from utility, where it's just having different things available to you. This is actually having different lines of play to do. And I think a really good example of this is if we look back to last format where we had both Magician FTK and Gym Knight FTK. And they both do the same thing pretty much. They have equal power, they're both FTKs, they're both pretty consistent, pretty equal in most other regards, but the major difference was diversity. Magicians could diversify their plays. Like if Gym Knight FTK didn't work out, you probably just lose because like you're playing Gym Knights and they don't do anything else. But if Magician FTK didn't work out, it was fine, you were still playing Magicians. And so you could still do some other things, you could still make a Vortex Dragon and that could just get you there. You could diversify your plays. I think a really good example of this right now is the Trickstar deck. And if you think about all of the different ways they can beat you, there's actually a ton of ways they can win. And it's really interesting, but they can beat you with Droll Reincarnation via card advantage, or they can beat you with card advantage just by naturally using their cards. They have a lot of advantage gaining cards, which is good. They can Firewall Loop you and win via fire, or they can burn you to death and win via fire. Or they can beat you in tempo with cards like Reincarnation, Widow Anchor, and some of the defensive links that you can make using a card like Scapegoat or like Hornet Drones. And so they really have a lot of different ways they can win. They can manage all three resources very well and in different ways. And they're able to go over the top and ignore card advantage, as Flores said. And so Trickstar is a deck that can beat you multiple ways, play multiple roles, and it truly exemplifies diversity in the current format. And so again, both utility and diversity make up about 10% each of a deck's overall strength. And so the 5 characteristics of the best decks are, once again, power, consistency, efficiency, utility, and diversity. These are the things that you want to look for in your own decks, as well as in other decks when evaluating and analyzing the format and the metagame. This is how I choose what decks I'm going to play, this is how I prepare, and I think it's going to help a lot of you do the same. It really allows you to see a deck's strengths and improve on that, while also seeing some of their weaknesses so that you can either fix them or capitalize on them. And so for example, Sky Strikers are what I'm playing right now, and they're really consistent, really efficient, they have utility, they have diversity, but they're severely lacking in power right now. And so as somebody playing the deck, an innovator is going to look for ways to address this by adding in cards to give them more power. They're going to look at cards like Diablos to put more damage on board. You might think of cards like Scapegoat or Phantom Sky Blaster to raise the ceiling that way. Or you might decide to cover this weakness by adding in more defense to allow you to extend the game to the mid and late game, where your deck really thrives the most due to its high utility and its efficiency. But this is just one example, and so you can see how using this information can help you make different and better decisions. And so I hope this video helps all of you do just that. And now with that being said, I did also want to discuss all the decks of the current format and look at them from this perspective, but I think this video is a little bit longer than I had hoped for already. As you guys know by now, I tend to ramble on, but if you're interested in that video, please go ahead and like this, and when this video gets to 50 likes, I will start working on that. I'm going to break down every single deck of the format and really measure them in terms of these 5 characteristics and stack them up against each other to really show what the best decks are, and you're really going to see how accurate this is. And so with that being said, thank you guys for watching as always, and I will see you in the next video. Stay top tier.